If you care about how ordinary people actually survived the Second World War, not in trenches or command rooms, but in kitchens cut off from supply, fuel, and certainty, then this is a story worth staying with. Before we begin, subscribe to the Survival Record if you value serious, grounded history that looks past the familiar headlines and into the mechanics of endurance. Because one of the least understood realities of World War II is this: for millions of civilians, survival did not hinge on heroism or ideology, but on food systems collapsing quietly and families improvising nutrition under conditions of near-total isolation. The popular memory of wartime food tends to revolve around ration cards, victory gardens, or state-organized scarcity. What is often overlooked is how quickly formal systems failed once transport broke down, borders hardened, or occupying forces stripped regions bare. In many places, families were not merely rationed, they were effectively abandoned. The meals they ate were not cultural curiosities, but emergency solutions, developed under pressure, passed quietly between neighbors, and later forgotten because they did not fit a triumphant post-war narrative. So the first reality to understand is that isolation, not hunger alone, really shaped wartime diets. In occupied Eastern Europe, rural France, the Balkans, and large parts of Asia, isolation was both physical and informational. Rail lines were destroyed or, requisitioned. Markets disappeared, livestock was confiscated. Families could not rely on relief, and often they could not risk travel. Meals became hyperlocal, built entirely from what could be grown, trapped, gathered, or preserved within walking distance. Nutrition suffered, but honestly, calories mattered more than balance. The goal was really just to stay functional. One such meal was, coarse bread, bulked with ground acorns, chestnuts, or beech nuts. Across Germany, Poland, and parts of France, flour shortages forced households to grind whatever starch could be made digestible. Acorns required careful leaching to remove tannins, a time-consuming process passed down from pre-industrial famine knowledge. The resulting bread was bitter, dense, and, frankly, nutritionally limited, but it filled stomachs and conserved precious grain. This practice later influenced post-war survival manuals and resistance training, which, emphasized wild starch identification as a core skill. In many regions, soup actually ceased to be a dish and became a delivery system for survival. Thin vegetable soups, often dismissed as starvation food, were actually carefully engineered. Nettles, sorrel, dock leaves, and even grass seeds were boiled, not for flavor, but for their extractable nutrients. In besieged cities like Leningrad, similar principles applied under far worse conditions, but, the same logic appeared in isolated villages across Europe. Long boiling broke down cellulose and made otherwise marginal plants digestible. Fat, when available, was added in microscopic amounts because it dramatically increased caloric absorption. These soups mattered because they preserved mobility and mental clarity, just enough for people to keep working, foraging, and, avoiding attention. After the war, military nutrition studies quietly noted that, populations who consumed regular hot liquids, even if those drinks had minimal calories, actually maintained their resilience longer than those who relied solely on dry substitutes. Protein, when it did appear, often came from sources that were, later erased from collective memory. In occupied territories, keeping livestock was honestly quite dangerous. Animals could attract confiscation or even denunciation. So, as a result, families turned to small, easily hidden protein sources, Rabbits, pigeons, cats, and sometimes even dogs were consumed quietly and, without any ceremony. In coastal or river regions, trapped fish, eels, and mollusks became, absolutely critical. In parts of Southeast Asia under Japanese occupation, insects like locusts, beetle larvae, and crickets were roasted or ground into paste. These meals rarely appear in official histories because, honestly, they challenge post-war notions of dignity and normalcy, yet they influenced later survival doctrine. Modern military and disaster survival training openly acknowledges small animal trapping and insect protein, lessons civilians had already learned under occupation. Fermentation became a substitute for refrigeration and, a tool for control. Isolation meant no ice, no salt, and no preservatives. Fermented foods, sauerkraut, sour milk, pickled roots, rice ferments, were not luxuries, but safeguards. In Eastern Europe and parts of China, families maintained fermentation crocks even when everything else was gone. Fermentation extended shelf life, improved digestibility, and reduced disease risk. Importantly, fermented foods allowed families to decouple survival from daily foraging. This reduced exposure to patrols and raids. After the war, intelligence services studying partisan survival noted fermentation as a low-visibility food security method, a detail later absorbed into Cold War civil defense thinking. Fats, not meat, became the most coveted survival currency. Butter, lard, and oil were more valuable than protein because fat carried calories efficiently. In isolated alpine communities and Scandinavian regions, meals centered on boiled roots or bark flour dumplings enriched with tiny amounts of animal fat. Even a spoonful could double the usable energy of a meal. This understanding reshaped later humanitarian food policy. Relief planners realized that calorie density mattered more than volume, a lesson paid for with civilian suffering years earlier. Children's meals quietly revealed the limits of endurance. Adults, could tolerate monotony and nutritional gaps longer than children. In many isolated households, special meals were reserved for the young. These included diluted milk substitutes made from oats or nuts, softened root mash, or broth that was carefully skimmed of contaminants. These meals were often nutritionally inadequate, which, unfortunately, led to stunted growth and long-term health effects that surfaced decades later. So, post-war epidemiological studies in Europe, actually linked childhood wartime diets to chronic illness. This connection, it ended up shaping later international standards for emergency feeding programs. Cultural food taboos, they really collapsed under sustained isolation. What people would not eat before the war honestly often became acceptable after months without supply. Bark bread in Scandinavia, seed cakes in France, and fish head stews in island communities. These were not innovations, but revivals of pre-modern famine foods. The war did not invent these meals. It forced their return. This matters because it demonstrates that survival knowledge does not disappear. It waits. Communities that remembered older food practices actually endured isolation better than those fully dependent on modern supply chains. Cooking methods themselves, they adapted to invisibility and scarcity. Open fires were dangerous, and honestly, smoke attracted attention. Meals were often cooked quickly at night or by using retained heat in buried pots. One-pot meals really dominated because they conserved fuel and reduced waste. These techniques influenced later resistance movements and were studied in post-war counterinsurgency manuals, though rarely credited to civilian innovation. What these meals reveal is not desperation, but systems thinking under pressure. Families assessed risk, energy return, and visibility with every meal. Food choices were tactical decisions. They balanced nutrition, safety, and sustainability over months or years. This quiet competence, really contradicts the idea of civilians as passive victims and shows how survival knowledge evolves outside formal institutions. Remembering these meals matters because, well, they expose the fragile assumptions underlying modern food security. They remind us that resilience is not stored in warehouses alone, but in knowledge, adaptability, and the willingness to revise cultural norms when conditions demand it. If you found value in understanding how ordinary families endured extraordinary isolation, go ahead and subscribe to the Survival Record for more in-depth historical analysis. And share this video with others who care about serious history and the lessons it still holds.